postulation that if pi h is greater than pi f, so if that red ratio goes down, E goes up, and if that red ratio, if pi h is smaller than pi f, then so that is negative, then this goes down, right? So there should be a relationship between the evolution of the nominal exchange rate and inflation differentials. So, or put differently, that's how people often phrase it. Delta ln ET should be equal to pi th minus pi tf. So this is the, if that's greater than 0, then you have a nominal depreciation of the domestic currency and if it's smaller than 0, then you have a nominal appreciation. Well, let me, sorry, I hate that, but that's delta ln ET, so the growth rate of the domestic currency. Okay, and so what relative purchasing power parity postulates is that the domestic currency depreciates when the domestic inflation rate is higher than the foreign inflation rate, and the domestic currency appreciates when the domestic currency inflation, or the domestic inflation, is smaller than the foreign inflation rate. Now please note, I'm selling this, quote unquote, as a causal relationship. That's not correct, because, I mean, changes in exchange rates also feed into domestic inflation rates. So it is a correlation. It doesn't mean that this causes that, because nominal exchange rate changes also affect inflation rates. That's the point, right? So if everything that you import becomes more expensive because your currency depreciates, this is the so-called exchange rate pass-through, then your inflation goes up. But as a correlation, we should expect to see it in the data. So, so that's what I have here, right? The growth rate of the nominal exchange rate should be should reflect the inflation differential. And here's the nerdy remark: this should not be interpreted as a causal relationship. Now, do we see that in the data? Well, that's what we see. This is from the path-breaking textbook of Philip Harms. So yeah, sorry about the marketing blog. Yeah, no, I did, right? You see that in other books as well. I think my book offers a lot of stuff that other books don't do, but that's, yeah. What I did is just.
Do you have an online version for your books?
Yes, of course. I mean, you can buy an ebook. That's yeah.
Because we couldn't find the VGU library. So
okay.
And we're not sure, like, if we buy a hard copy, how it will get shifted to.
No, this is I mean, little footnote, right? I agreed to write that book in the early 2000s. The first version was German. Why did I write in German? Because the publisher said this series is in German. Then the publisher approached me after a while and said, would you be interested in doing a second edition in English? And I said, sure. Because I had this weird situation that I was teaching all my classes in English and had this German textbook. And I said, look, you want... So, but the publisher is a more small publishing house in Tübingen. It's very well respected in Germany, but it's not like Springer or one of these North Holland or these big giant publishing houses. And I'm not sure that in terms of distribution, they're doing an excellent job. I will show you. There's an ebook version that you can purchase, and I hope that right, and then you get a link essentially. Anyway, right? Don't be upset, right? This doesn't mean that you have to read my book to pass the exam. You have to understand what I'm doing here in the course to pass the exam. So coming back to this, we see that if we run a regression of the average rate of depreciation against the US dollar between 95 and 2010, right? And this is what I did here. 15 years, and regresses on the average inflation rate relative to the United States. So that's pi H minus pi US dollar, United States. And you see that you get a pretty strong result, right? I mean, I think this is Syria and this is Libya. There's some outliers, but by and large, you see that there's a strong correlation, right? Maybe not so strong when you go to the really small, low inflation countries, right? When you zoom into this part, then maybe the relationship is not so strong. But when you come to the very high inflation rate countries, you see that these countries saw their currencies depreciate big time. So between 1995 and 2010, this country exhibited a much larger inflation rate than the United States, horizontal axis, and its currency substantially depreciated against the US dollar. Now you could argue it had a higher inflation rate than the United States because of the depreciation, or you could argue it depreciated because of the higher inflation rate. But that's, when you talk about correlations, you can go either way. That's not the point. Now, how do we wrap up on relative purchasing power parity? Well, few economists claim that relative purchasing power parity holds at every point in time. Most real exchange rates are not constant. Period, right? You saw that for the US dollar Swiss franc real exchange rate. We see it for the US dollar euro real exchange rate. It's just not a constant. However, it may still hold in the long run. Deviations may be temporary, and the real exchange rate may exhibit a tendency to return to some constant value. That's what you observed. So this reconciles figure 5.6 and 5.7 over the long run, and on average, nominal exchange rates adjust to support relative PPP. So the theory of relative PPP thus suggests that the equilibrium real exchange rate can be determined as the long run average of QT. And how do you compute that? That's what I hinted at a couple of minutes ago. I mean, suppose you have a real exchange rate that moves like this. Then you would basically, suppose you say, what can you say about the real exchange rate at this point in time? Well, just compute, and it is so simple that it almost sounds silly. You just compute something like the sample mean and say this is Q, and now it's above Q, so apparently it's undervalued in real terms. Now, I will present much simpler or much more sophisticated real theories of the real exchange rate. So that should be, by the way, that should be a T. People have put that to a test and said, actually, when it's about prediction, this simple thing doesn't perform so badly. However, only when you look at economies that have a similar economic structure. So UK and Germany, maybe Japan and Germany, although there are already big differences. United States and Germany. So you shouldn't do that for the Vietnamese dong. But as a theory of the real exchange rate, relative purchasing power parity is convincing by its simplicity. right? You just say, you take the long run average, say, you know, here it was excessively low, here it is excessively high, and here, again, apparently the observed real exchange rate is very high relative to the long run average. And of course, what you would say then to say there might be a tendency to go back. Okay, so that's an almost embarrassingly simple approach. Now, we have 50 minutes to go, and I've said a few nice things about purchasing power parity. Now let me tear it apart. A critique of PPP, first of all, is based as theories of equilibrium real exchange rates, absolute and relative PPP are likely to be too simplistic, especially when we look at emerging and developing economies. First of all, the underlying assumptions, law of one price, identical consumption baskets, etc., may be violated. So, it goes back to the law of one price, and we have all reasons to believe that the law of one price holds for some goods, but it doesn't hold for other goods. Why? Well, because goods arbitrage may be costly. In some cases, it might be outright illegal, right? I mean, take the current US president. I mean, he raises trade barriers. That means that there will be different prices in different countries, right? If you have to pay a 35% tariff or a 50% or whatever, 64% or whatever, then of course it's not surprising that the law of one price fails. Sometimes tariffs are not high, but quantitative restrictions are there. So let me tell you from my own biography, there was a time in my life when I lived in Zurich and I worked in Constance. So Zurich is in Switzerland and Constance in Germany. Now this is, from an economic point of view, this is the silliest thing that you can do. Why? Because you live in the high price country and you work in the low wage country. Most people do it the other way around. They live in Germany and they work in Switzerland, right? We talked about this on the first day, kind of. Now, why did I do that? Well, because I was subsidized by my wife. Now, when I went to Constance, I went to the university, I did my job. In the evening, I returned to Zurich and I brought home stuff. So before boarding the train from Constance to Zurich, which takes about 90 minutes, I went into a shop and I bought stuff. Milk, diapers for our kids, or actually for our first son, and bread. Now the bread was important because a lot of stuff is very tasty in Switzerland, but the bread is not as good as in Germany. Swiss would probably be offended by that, but that's, if you go to Germany, the kind of bread is something very nice. Diapers was also not a big deal, but milk in Switzerland is twice as expensive as in Germany. And please note, you can walk from Germany to Switzerland. It's not a big, there's not, the German-Swiss border is very, it's very close. Actually, Constance seamlessly transits into a Swiss city that's called Kreuzlingen, and so you cannot even see from the top, you cannot see the difference. So every night I brought home a liter or two of milk. It was not a big deal. Now, customs officials checked me. They checked me once. I said, look, I have milk, but these were quantities that I was allowed to bring into Switzerland, right? Small quantities are allowed. And they nodded at me and said, okay, that's fine. Now, where am I aiming? I'm aiming at, if I had shown up with a truck full of milk at the border and said, I want to transport that to Zurich because your price is twice as high as the price in Germany, and I want to sell it at slightly below the Swiss price, customs officials would have said, look, we have to have a word with you because that's forbidden, right? So you can import 2 liters, but not much more. And so there's all kinds of trade barriers that may destroy the law of warrant price. Secondly, from a purchasing power parity perspective, fluctuations of Q are interpreted as temporary deviations from a constant long-run equilibrium. So when this goes up, then you say it will go down again. When it goes down, you say it goes up again. But I will later show you examples where you had a massive trend in the real exchange rate. And that in turn is not compatible with there only being temporary deviations. In fact, what PPP ignores is that the real exchange rate, which is all about relative price in different countries, may be driven by fundamental forces that are potentially driving the real exchange rate away from a constant value. And that's something that's particularly more important for emerging markets. So as a relative price, the real exchange rate is determined in general equilibrium that is tied to other variables which are ignored by the theory of PPP. So PPP, by the end of the day, is a partial equilibrium approach, right? It doesn't consider that in general equilibrium, everything is related to everything. And I mean, you've been exposed to a number of general equilibrium models, right? And what we learn from general equilibrium models is that few things are exogenous, right? Prices are endogenous, quantities are endogenous, prices react to quantities react to prices. And saying that the real exchange rate behaves like this, right, is kind of naive. So we should allow for the fact that the real exchange rate is driven by real shocks that reflect scarcity, changing consumption habits, all kinds of things that PPP just doesn't have on the radar. So to make a long story short, purchasing power parity is a nice thing to know. Purchasing power parity is surprisingly good at predicting when you have the currencies of structurally very similar countries. But purchasing power parity is conceptually on very weak foundations because we're talking about a relative price, actually a whole bundle of relative prices, which should be explained in general equilibrium, not just, as something returning to some long-run average. So that's the overture for some more sophisticated consideration of the real exchange rate. Now, what are the empirical challenges? Now, for the theory of PPP. Now, so far I've just said some conceptual critique. Now, first point is the observed correlation between GDP per capita and the real exchange rates can hardly be interpreted as a temporary deviation from PPP. I'll show you some pictures to illustrate that. Secondly, the strong real appreciations observed in rapidly growing emerging economies can hardly be interpreted as temporary deviations from PPP. So here's the first thing. So this is again taken from a textbook, but I've tapped data from UBS. UBS is a big Swiss bank, and in fact it's by now the big Swiss bank. There used to be 3 big Swiss banks, then one was swallowed by another in the 90s, and now a year ago Credit Suisse essentially disappeared. You may have heard about that. Anyway, it's now Union Bank of Switzerland is the big Swiss bank. Now what does Union Bank do? Union Bank of Switzerland manages portfolios, manages wealth, does all kinds of things, but they also did until quite recently something very interesting. They published a publication called Prices and Earnings Around the World. Why did they do that? Well, it was not research doing it, it was public relations. Now, Union Bank of Switzerland manages the fortunes of very wealthy people. Very wealthy people often move from one place to another. So you have a new job in New York City, then you're offered a job in London. Then you get offered a job in Zurich, then you get offered a job in Tokyo. Now, suppose you get a salary offer from a Japanese bank in Japanese yen. Or suppose you get a salary offer from a German bank. Now let me be more specific. And suppose the salary offer is 200,000 euros per year. Is that attractive?
Yes.
How do you know?
For what kind of position, for example?
Well, for a position that might be a nice job.
I think kind of like I would have guessed the normal range for like 60K per year, 60, 70K per year, so 200K per year seems to be quite attractive.
In Germany.
Yeah.
I think it depends on the place I live.
Yes, and why does it? Why does it?
Because I will use my salary to buy other stuff.
Right. So that's exactly going in the right direction. And I mean, your answer is right. But what do you have to know to judge whether some monetary remuneration in a given place is attractive?
The standard of living in that place.
The standard of living, sure, but
Cost of living.
I could how many costs I could buy by my salary.
exactly. I mean, put it simply, how many chocolate bars can you buy with your salary? How many restaurant meals can you buy? How many square meters can you afford? And suppose you say, oh, 200,000 sounds like a great salary, and then you show up at the place and you learn that a pack of chewing gum costs 50,000, right? Of course, you know that, but the mistake that you shouldn't do is take the 200,000, translate it into Vietnamese dong, and think this is a gigantic sum, right? We're talking about millions, if not billions of Vietnamese dong. And then imagine how much stuff you can buy here in Vietnam, because that's not the case. You will be exposed to the price structure in the place where you go, right? And so I can tell you that if someone offers you a salary of, say, 60,000 Swiss francs for a job in Zurich,
Consider.
that's kind of okay, right? But given the price level in Zurich, and I'm talking about an annual salary, right? 60,000 is not so much. You can still have a decent living, but it's not great, right? So coming back to the point, what UBS did, they published information on prices around the world. It said, how expensive are different countries? And what they did, and this is that what I found so nice, is they established standardized goods baskets. So they were very precise and said, what is the combination of one meal in a decent restaurant, a 75 square meter apartment per month, a basket of home electronics, a taxi ride. So they had all kinds of things in their basket. What does that cost relative to Zurich in different places? Well, I did rebase the whole thing. So all these prices are the standardized goods basket in 2015 relative to New York City. Now what you observe, you have on the horizontal axis, you have the GDP per capita PPP adjusted. PPP adjustment, I'll come back to that later, what that means. It means, in fact, that you're accounting for the fact that countries have different price levels. So this is a more reliable measure of the standards of living. So basically, this is, the more you go into this direction, the richer countries are in terms of GDP. So what do you observe when you look at that? Yeah, say, express it in words. What is that? Yes, richer countries are more expensive. That's the point, right? So relative to New York City, if you are here, and I mean there's few countries that are richer than the United States, but these countries have a higher price. In fact, there's two dots on top of each other. This is two countries in two places in Brazil, Rio and Sao Paulo. And when you take that seriously, what that is essentially, this is the inverted US dollar Brazilian real UBA's basket based exchange rate. So what that says is that you have a negative correlation between income levels and exchange rate. So compared to absolute purchasing power parity, it seems like the rich countries have overvalued currencies and the poor countries have undervalued currencies. Now, if you are a purchasing power parity nut, right, and you think this is the theory and there's nothing else, you would say, you know, this is just a coincidence. Because basically, I mean, it's not a problem that there are deviations from PPP. What is the problem here is that there's a systematic deviation. We see a pattern. And this pattern is not, you know, it's very strong. Rich countries are expensive, poor countries are inexpensive. And it's just problematic to say, well, this country's currency is overvalued and this country's currency is undervalued, because that would mean that, you know, we have some persistent deviations from absolute purchasing power parity. All right, what's the next slide? Now, there is a next slide, but I'll give you a break in a second. This is called the Penn effect. The Penn effect is the positive correlation between income levels and inverted real exchange rates. Please note this is an inverted real exchange rate because we're taking nominal exchange, we are translating everything into a joint currency and then we're dividing, right? I did that for the Brazilian real. It's called the Penn effect for the following reason. It was because the University of Pennsylvania for decades hosted the so-called International Comparison Project. And the International Comparison Project did what? It collected prices from all over the world to compute purchasing power parities. And then people found that, in fact, we have that stubbornly strong correlation between relative price levels and per capita income levels. So rich countries are more expensive. So from that point, that is a blow in the face of absolute purchasing power parity, right? Because absolute purchasing power parity says the Big Mac should cost, it's based on the assumption that the Big Mac should cost the same in all countries. That's the very basis. Now here you see that the Big Mac is expensive in rich countries and inexpensive in poor countries, systematically so. And this will be the basis for, you know, learning more about the real exchange rate, which we will do tomorrow. Now, let's take 15 minutes as a break, you know, to relax, and then let's go into this problem set on the EBA. Do you want to give this some